Geek. Talking baseball every week. Cause they're Gleeman and the Geek.
And welcome to Gleeman and the Geek, the delayed therapy session. I'm John Bonas of TwinsDaily.com. With me, Aaron Gleeman of TheAthletic.com. I say delayed because we've already done the therapy podcast once. We did it on the Patreon a couple days ago.
Yeah, I was going to say a lot has happened in the week since we last spoke, but the truth is we've spoken plenty since then to the Patreon subscribers.
That's right.
So I would hope, we know about a quarter of all of you listening to this are also Patreon subscribers. So hello to you guys.
And it's probably a good time to mention we're not doing a show next week. We're taking a week off. We always take
for
a week
winter
off
solstice.
For winter solstice. There you go. That's right. Yeah.
But I just want to say, we're going to talk about Correa. Mm-hmm. We're going to talk about Christian Vázquez, even though no one wants to talk about Christian Vázquez now. I'm headed after this. I'm leaving from John's house to go to Target Field to meet Christian Vázquez for the first time, and I sort of feel like, buddy, you picked the wrong time to do this.
Just the two of you?
Yeah,
Just have a little lunch, something like that?
We're going to go to Spoon Stable for a nice romantic brunch. No, but if you don't want to wait a week between shows, we have an alternative for you. And it's a great way to support the show if you just love the show. We have a Patreon podcast, Patreon, patreon.com/Gleeman is the website. And if you go there, we did a show the next morning after they signed Christian Vázquez. And then we did a show the next morning after they did not sign officially Carlos Correa. And so if you are jonesing for immediate reactions to Twins news, and I will also say, we're going to talk a lot about those two guys, and especially the Correa. But we did an hour plus on each of those subjects individually. So if you are jonesing for immediate reactions and commercial-free hour-plus discussions in depth, even by our standards, in depth.
I'm also guessing, although you're not going to get a free episode for 2 weeks, we're probably doing a mailbag next week.
Yes,
right.
That's
lots of questions. Right.
Patreon, you also get. We do mailbag episodes and we do some interviews with people and all that. So we would love to have you join us. And it costs $1 when we put a new episode out. If we don't put a new episode out for a couple weeks, it costs you nothing.
That's right.
Patreon.com/Gleeman. Okay, so since we last spoke on this version of the podcast, I used to call it the regular show, but that implies the Patreon listeners are irregular, and I don't like that because they're, we like them.
I think both shows are irregular to me, but certainly both shows listeners are irregular.
Well, it's like I described
both shows hosts.
I wrote about Correa, obviously for The Athletic after it happened, and I was trying to talk about their pivot options, and I said the least bad options are because I don't know that any of them are good. There probably aren't any regular aspects of this show. But so since we last spoke, they signed Christian Vázquez, a 32-year-old longtime Red Sox, and then spent the last 2 months of last season with the Astros winning a second World Series. He was the starting catcher on the 2018 Red Sox that won the World Series, to a 3-year, $30 million deal, which checked a clear box that needed to be checked. That Derek Falvey talked about from day one of the offseason. We need to find a veteran catcher that is capable of starting at least half the games or more when paired with Ryan Jeffers, essentially replacing Gary Sanchez. But they were hoping to get a defensive upgrade and all that. And he checks that box in, I don't want to say a perfect way, but he certainly checks that box in every way. And I like the signing, and then a day later, basically, they lose Carlos Correa to a 13-year, $350 million deal with the San Francisco Giants. Like I said, no one then cares about Christian Vázquez. I won't say that to him when I see him in an hour and a half, but hey, buddy, no one cares about you. What I'm wondering is, we can talk about all that stuff. And then also since then, it's also been an incredibly busy week for free agent pitching signings. Almost every key pitcher who was still available, including last night, Carlos Rodon signed a 6-year, $162 million deal with the New York Yankees, which takes him off the market.
Basically, the only one standing is Eovaldi.
Yes.
And
so
not particularly.
Rodon signed with the Yankees. Chris Bassett signed with the Blue Jays. Noah Syndergaard went to the Dodgers. Ross Stripling went to the Giants. Sean Manaea went to the Giants. Kodai Senga went to the Mets previous to that. And then that's basically it.
Noah Syndergaard. Did you mention him?
I said that to
the
Dodgers.
Yeah.
Of the top 20, I rank every offseason for The Athletic. It's funny, people respond to that article in the comments and they go, the Twins are never going to sign any of these guys, the top 20 free agents. Right. And I want to scream, it's not a Twins article. This is for the entire Athletic.
Right,
but whatever. You know. But of the top 20 free agent starters, you know, I had DeGrom number 1, I had Johnny Cueto number 20. Right. 3 are left, unsigned. Okay. Number 6 is Nathan Eovaldi, who we've talked quite a bit about. And then number 19 and 20 are unsigned, which tells me I did a decent job ranking. Number 19 is Michael Wacha, and number 20 is Johnny Cueto, and those really have no use to the Twins' rotation, which we've talked about. They have 5 or 8 guys who are as good or better than that and cheaper than that. But Eovaldi would certainly work, but we'll get to the pivot options, you know, later. We should say that, well, it won't be till tomorrow, I guess, or Monday for people to sign up for the Winter Meltdown, assuming there are any tickets remaining.
Assuming there are any tickets. I mean, you can still, if you go out to Twins Daily right now and sign up to be a caretaker, you can be guaranteed that you can get a ticket and up to 3 additional ones if you want to pay half price.
TwinsDaily.com. Did you announce the second guest yet, or is that Monday?
I have, yes, today, this morning.
So the first guest is, well, I don't know. We'll decide the order. Who wants to open for whom? Who wants to lead off? Not a lot of speed to choose from in the leadoff spot for these 2 guests, but, you know, good arm strength.
Good middle of the order bats.
Yeah, big boppers both.
That's right.
Patrick Royce will be one of the guests at the Winter Meltdown, and then 3-time All-Star closer Glenn Perkins will be the other guest. I have no input on these guests. Right. I just show up, honestly. I don't get any of the proceeds. I don't do any of the planning. I'm not involved in Twins Daily in any sort of official capacity. But these are, if you said to me, give me a list of 5 guests you'd want, you know, it'd be like Rihanna. I'd like to talk to about some things. But no, these would be 2 of the 5, certainly. Yeah. So I'm excited about that. And hopefully if we can figure out the recording at the Poorhouse, which we didn't last time, it'll be available on a podcast.
Yeah, we usually put that one out as a free podcast, provided we actually are able to record it.
We'll see how much they curse.
Provided we don't end up with a drag show.
Might have to be a
fashion show.
Yeah, we did that once. It might have to be a Patreon just for the cursing. Who knows?
Well, maybe. Yeah.
That's fine.
That might be the one explicit one we do.
That was my Royce impression. Okay, so it was funny. I was asked, I went on Barrero's show yesterday. Okay. And he said, at first, I thought he was kidding, but then I realized he wasn't kidding. And he said, do you think fans should be upset at the local media for getting their hopes up that Carlos Correa was definitely going to re-sign with the Twins? And I laughed at first, and then he said it a second time with a serious face, and I thought, well, you didn't listen to the podcast, or for that matter, listen to me when I was on the show.
Right.
I'm not actually ripping him for that. I'm just saying. We literally said at the beginning of the offseason, John said 3.5% chance of Correa signing, and I said a 5% chance. And then we revised it about a week and a half ago, once it was clear the Twins were still in the mix and some teams had dropped out and all that. And I said 8 to 10%. I went back and listened to it. 8 to 10%. And you said 20%.
Right.
So if that is misleading fans, I in fact have been ripped on Twitter and comment sections for being too pessimistic about it. Why can't you let fans blah blah blah? Right. So anyway, as we discuss that, I'm personally happy with how we portrayed the entire process from the point Correa signed, saying he was going to opt out, even though people seemed confused by that notion all season, and then even now, when I'm not trying to prepare you for the worst case. I'm just trying to be realistic with stuff. And, I feel now that Twins fan says every right to be disappointed that he signed with the Giants and frustrated, but to be surprised, I don't see that. And we can only do so much.
I'm trying to think of a single person in the local media
that's the thing.
that said it was likely to happen.
I'm not shy about blaming somebody else for something.
Right.
But maybe I haven't been reading.
It's not just us.
There's certain people I don't read, but
I think what happens is when there is wall-to-wall coverage of something, you think, oh, this is real. This is going to happen.
Right.
You know what I mean? And there was wall-to-wall coverage of it because they've been talking back and forth, and everybody has sources. Everybody hears about the talking back and forth.
Well, and there's wall-to-wall coverage of things people are interested in.
Right. And there's wall-to-wall, and it's a national story.
Right.
So you get, every time he talks to another team, you get a story on it, right? He's going to fly out and see Steve Cohen. Well, we're going to hear about the Mets. The Yankees are sniffing around. Well, we're going to hear about the Yankees being in on it. And Scott Boras is really good at keeping his guys' names in the paper and at generating that sort of stuff. And as a result of that, even if nobody thinks it's going to happen, because you keep hearing about it, you're like, oh, is this going to happen? This is going to
right. You just assume with each passing day, okay, there must be something to this. And there was something to it. Ultimately,
there really was.
Dan Hayes reported, and other people have reported since then, that the Twins' final offer to Correa was 10 years and $285 million, which is would have been the largest contract in the history of the Twins by $100 million. Even if you over the Mauer contract, even if you adjust for inflation, over that, whatever, it's been a decade plus since the Mauer contract, it's still roughly like $50 million more than the Mauer contract. I mean, this was a level, which I reported last week, where that got picked up by all kinds of aggregators and stuff, which always bothers me. But, it's above and beyond anything they've ever made. It's a massive, historic offer from their point of view.
Right.
But as we cautioned and said they feared, a massive, historic, franchise-altering offer from the Twins' point of view can just be Tuesday for the San Francisco Giants. And in fact, they signed him to a deal less than an offer they had made a different player, Aaron Judge, 5 days earlier or a week earlier. I'm not saying it's just the average day for the Giants, but it's not anywhere near the level. And that's what the Twins were fearful of. And it came to fruition basically exactly that way, which is we're swimming along here in the deep waters and we're pushing forward. And they did add significant money to their initial offer. And 10 years, $285. I don't know that at the beginning of the offseason I would have said that'll probably get Carlos Correa, but it's within reason. I think.
Sure. I mean, especially if you take a look at what Trey Turner got, what Xander Bogaerts got.
And there are some reports that as of 2 days before the signing, the Giants were much closer to slightly over $300 million and pushed to $350. And so the Twins were within, 10 to 15% at some point in this process. Now, ultimately, but the fear was, one of these teams, and it turned out to be the Giants, because the Cubs weren't really in the mix, the Yankees weren't really in the mix.
Dodgers. Padres already signed somebody. Right.
It turned out that the fear of, one of these teams is just going to get sick of this thing and just say screw it and blow the Twins out of the water, and that's exactly what happened. You can end it, basically, if you're the Giants, and they did.
I do wonder, how Boris got the Giants to basically say, second place is 285. How about you do 350?
We don't know that's second place.
Right. Well, that's what I was wondering. Right. That's a fair point.
I mean, we may
to say that they got $65 million more than the.
Yes, but they also stretched it an extra 3 years, which, as we've talked about, the reason you're seeing. And Bryce Harper started it 3 years ago with a 13-year deal. Right. But now Bogaerts and Turner each signed 11-year deals that take them, I believe, through age 40 or 41, which teams, it's not, and now Correa's 13-year deal takes them through age 40. It's not because teams are much more confident in these players aging. It's that the teams that are typically the biggest spenders have luxury tax ramifications, that they want to stay under the luxury tax. And so they're basically gotten to a point where they determine the money that it will take to sign a player, and then they get them to stretch it over as many years as possible, because a $350 million 10-year deal, which would have been more typical for Carlos Correa, $35 million a year average annual salary in terms of how it counts against the luxury tax. But for 13 years, it's a shade under $27 million. And that's $8 million less per year that you have to spend before you hit the luxury tax, which is, a reliever or a bench player or something like that. But beyond that, it keeps you from reaching the second, third, and fourth levels of the luxury tax, where a dollar spent gets taxed at some point at $2. And so that's why you're seeing all these big spending teams stretch these deals to absurd levels. And 10 years from now, we're going to see players. I mean, think of all the star players that have been washed up at 35, 36, 37. Now these guys are signed for $20+ million a year through age 40. Some of these guys are just going to get released at some point. So it's going to be interesting to watch that. But from the Twins standpoint, that's another thing they have to sort of fight against, which is they're never going to be up against the luxury tax. It would be amazing if they were, but they're not nowhere near luxury tax. That's not a consideration for them, but it is a consideration for all of the other teams in the bidding for a player like Carlos Correa. And so,
well, I mean, for just as a side, Rodon, right, who just signed with the Yankees. We're going to talk about that later. $27 million contract. But next year, on top of that, from luxury tax, they're going to have to pay like $16, $17 million on top of that. So essentially, they signed him not to a $27 million contract per year contract, but to a $44 or $45 million contract per year. I mean, and
every dollar at some point gets to be so expensive that it, unless you're Steve Cohen of the Mets, or you're the Yankees or the Dodgers, there are teams that are, yes, $8 million of more leeway each year is going to have an impact, not so much for the $8 million itself, but for what it does to the luxury tax ramifications of everything. So that's what
it just sort of demonstrates how wide the chasm is between the haves and the have-nots.
Now, ultimately, Correa got the fourth largest contract in the history of baseball, behind Mike Trout, Mookie Betts, and Aaron Judge. He now has the largest contract in terms of money in the history of shortstops, beating Lindor, Tatis, Seager, who was matched up against him as a free agent last offseason and got 10,325, and then Trey Turner, who just got 11,300.
And I mean, and Boris basically said right from the beginning, the money they were looking for was better than Lindor, 341.
Yes, and the other funny thing is,
and I did not think he'd get there.
There was so much skepticism, with the decision he made to sign with the Twins initially last spring, take the 3-year deal that was really a gussied up 1-year deal, rather than $275 million from the Tigers or whatever his other offers were at the time. There was growing skepticism as these other shortstops came off the board, Bogaerts and Turner especially, of Correa's market must not be, and in fact, the opposite was true ultimately, because in addition to 13 years, $350, he also got 1 year, $35 million from the Twins.
Right.
So from the time he hit free agency initially last offseason as a 27-year-old, he got 14 years, $385 million, which would be, if it were a single contract, the second largest contract in the history of the sport. I think they did pretty well, Carlos Correa and Scott Boras. Yeah, unfortunately for the Twins wish they would have done slightly less well, I suppose. But the other thing,
we'd have been happier with 11 years and $320 million.
Well, or 10 to 85 probably would have made people happy too. As I look back on this thing, the whole process, the month-long or so process, where, like you said, there were daily reports, and I reported some of them, Dan reported a lot of them, all that. I think the turning point, in retrospect,
Judge,
was the night that everyone in San Diego at the winter meetings went to bed thinking Judge was about to or had agreed to a deal with the Giants, and then woke up to a 5 a.m. report that he actually got the Yankees to match the 9-year, $360 million deal, and he was going back to the Yankees. And in retrospect, at the time, I did think the Giants were probably the number one threat for Correa, but I also thought the Cubs or the Yankees themselves or whoever, who knows, could be in the mix. But ultimately, I believe it turned out that the Giants were what kept the Twins from re-signing Carlos Correa. We may hear otherwise.
I think you're right.
Days. And so if you can replay that, now maybe Judge goes to the Giants and then the Yankees just pivot to Correa.
Or they pivot to Bogaerts and San Diego jumps in. You know what I mean? Like there's a lot of different ways that dominoes can fall in a different direction.
But I do think that was sort of the sliding doors moment, sort of, the fork in the road. There's two alternate realities here. And the one where Judge goes back to the Yankees ends with the Giants using that money basically to sign Correa, which, I think what the Twins had hoped was, and we talked about it a lot during the season, was that
they would win the tiebreaker.
Yeah, that they could, because he enjoyed his season in Minnesota on and off the field, and his wife liked the Twin Cities, and he felt treated well, and all that stuff.
The organization and the players and everything.
All that stuff. Yep. I believe all that to be the case. From talking to Correa during the season, from talking to Twins officials, the last month or so, I believe that to be genuine. They were hoping that if all things were equal or, close to equal, in other words, if they offered him $285 and the Giants offered him $300, or they offered him $10,285 and the Giants offered him $11,295 or something like that. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. If it was within striking distance, that would be the tiebreaker. That the known commodity, he likes the city, he likes the people involved, he likes the ballpark, all that stuff.
If his market stayed in the range of $300 million, which is where Turner ended up, it's where
we don't know that that's true.
No, we don't know that.
But that's what the Twins were hoping.
Right.
But ultimately,
and they might have been right.
Yeah, maybe they were right, but we'll never know.
No, because
it wasn't close. It was 300.
The concern the entire time was that
It ended up being $65 million difference from, by the way, one of the most successful teams of the past decade. They have 3 championships in 12 years.
And there are worse hellholes to live in than San Francisco.
Yeah. I've loved San Francisco. I've been there twice. It's amazing. It's a great ballpark. It's a storied franchise. All that stuff. I would have liked to have found out. I think it would have been intriguing to find out for informational purposes, if nothing else, if he had signed for 300 with the Giants. Then you can say, well, that stuff didn't really matter.
Right.
At least it didn't matter in terms of,
ultimately he's going to choose the $15 million.
Right. And maybe that would be the case too.
Yeah, nobody would blame you for taking an extra 15.
But $65 million, it's not anything in the realm of, I mean, nobody in any circumstance, even if we're just talking about percentage of your salary as opposed to 65
We should mention it's also it's a commitment deal. It's no trade and
full no trade, no opt-outs.
And no opt-outs.
It's similar to the Bryce Harper deal.
That's
where
right.
it's like, we're together.
Yep.
This is going to be my last contract.
That's right.
Which also, it makes me, I don't want to say sad, but it's going to be weird. Carlos Correa is going to retire someday in a Giants uniform probably, and may go into the Hall of Fame. That'll be an interesting debate. Houston or San Francisco, and the 1 year in Minnesota is just going to be this weird like layover between stops, which is just so strange.
It'll be a weird line on his baseball card.
Like, people will legitimately not remember that, which is, I guess, unfortunate for the Twins. But I think the one thing that I don't know. You can go either way on this, right? So you can say, well, it's perfectly justifiable from the Twins' standpoint that they didn't match or beat the fourth largest contract in the history of baseball, a $350 million 13-year deal. Like, anytime before the last 10 months, anytime before Correa's arrival, the notion that they would even be considering that type of deal for the first 60 years of Twins history would have been absolutely absurd. Nobody would have even given it the time of day. We would not have even have it in our heads as an idea. Right. And so it's only the fact that Correa...
Either locally or nationally. Nobody would have...
They would have thought it was a typo if the Twins were listed as a suitor for Correa in normal circumstances. So I think, while it's disappointing, I think you can say... If you probably surveyed Twins fans, I saw you did post a thing on Twins Daily, and if you said, should they have topped that offer? I think it's absolutely reasonable for most Twins fans to be like, no, probably not. If you're trying to put yourself in the shoes of the front office. Right. If you're just a fan who wants to watch Carlos Correa, give him $10 billion. Who cares?
Right.
The flip side, though, is, to me, and what is interesting about the length differences is if you've decided to take the plunge at 10 years, $285 million, what difference does it make at that point, years 11, 12, and 13? Now, I realize it's 3 more years. Now, and each year, the Twins' offer would have taken him through his age 37 season, which is scary enough. And age 38 is significantly more likely to include a collapse than age 37, and then age 39 is significantly more. It really compounds to the point that by age 40, most guys are not even going to be usable regulars. And so I get that, and $65 million is a lot of money. But my point was more twofold. One, what is baseball even going to look like in 10, 12, 13 years? In other words, what are revenues going to be? I mean, we've seen them skyrocket over the last 10, 12, 13 years. 50% higher payrolls, 50% higher average salaries. And if that's the case over the next 13 years, then a $28 million average salary
looks like an $18 million
salary. It's it's a lot, but it's not some crazy, it's not the top of the payroll. And beyond that, I don't even mean this in the sense that they're going to get fired, although, I realize there are people with pitchforks out about the front office now. But this front office this will be their 7th season in place this upcoming season. The odds of them still being around in any context 13 years from now, basically 2 decades at the helm, are minuscule. Terry Ryan didn't even make it 2 consecutive decades at the helm. Do you know what I mean? There's such a limited number of GMs or president of baseball ops who have done that. And so I wonder, I might try to ask Falvey this if I see him today at Target Field. I would have been tempted in their shoes to say, if I thought 10-285 was something we wanted to do, I would have been tempted to say, let's do whatever we can to get him on the team today and keep him on the team today. And let years
the
11,
GM in 2033 worry about that.
That can be someone else's problem. And it might not even be that big of a problem.
That is potentially where ownership comes in. Right. That is potentially where the ownership...
Although I've heard they were certainly pushing for Correa to the extent, whatever that means. But the Poleads loved Correa. They thought he was, face of the franchise-wise. You couldn't draw up a better... representative of the team on and off the field.
And that's what that's actually the part of this that is going to hurt, I think, the most is, we'll talk a little bit about pivot options on where they can end up going, but they did have a chance to have, a face of the franchise for the next 10 years. They got the kind of guy that you take a look at, and then when free agents come to visit, Carlos Correa is going to be one of the guys meeting with them and trying to talk them into coming to the team and blah, blah, blah.
Because of the odd circumstances the first time around with the lockout and he fired his agent and all that stuff, they had access to a player level that they just, like we said, there was no other time before the last 10 months when the Twins being involved with a $300 million free agent would have even been feasible for anybody. And it became feasible in this specific case with this specific player, but I don't know that that's going to be the case ever again or for a long time. Before we get into some of the more other nuts and bolts with the Correa stuff, let's talk about our first sponsor, which is BetterHelp. If you need an actual therapy session after this instead of our little group therapy session, you can get BetterHelp. The way it works is if you've been thinking about trying to get help in some area of your life, this removes kind of the barrier for entry. This removes any stumbling blocks, any reason to put it off for another day. They're very easy to get in touch with. You can schedule something within days. If you want to do a video chat with somebody who's a licensed therapist, you can do that. If you don't want to be on camera, you just don't want to do a phone call, they can do that. If you don't even feel like being on the phone, and you just want to type to someone across a computer screen and still be able to ask questions and get help, they offer that too. They offer all kinds of different options with all kinds of different licensed therapists. It
completely removes the obstacles. All you have to do is fill out a brief questionnaire. You get matched up with a licensed therapist, and you can switch therapists too at any time for no additional charge. This one's not working for me.
If you want to live a more empowered life, therapy can get you there. And you can also get 10% off your first month if you go to betterhelp.com/Gleeman. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/Gleeman. Our second sponsor of the day.
I am really
Storyworth.
Happy. Yeah, I'm really happy that I found Storyworth several years ago. It absolutely helped. First of all, it was just a very cool thing to be able to get to know my parents when they were younger. Before I was around, get to know them as, human beings as opposed to just, mom and dad, and it's a brilliant process. All you do is you sign that person up, right? You can do it online, so you don't have to go shopping or anything like this. It can happen immediately.
It's a great last-minute gift, too. But
Fantastic.
There's no shipping involved.
Christmas gift. And, I also, if you've got some siblings, get them involved in it, too. What that person gets, my mom would get a weekly email, and that email just had a question. Simple question,
like prompt, basically.
Yeah, basically. Yeah, like
what's the story about your first job?
Yeah.
Who was your best friend growing up?
Tell us about a vacation you like. Yeah, exactly.
Random questions to get them telling stories and talking.
And she just replies to the email, right?
Super easy.
I get a copy of that. I would forward that copy to my siblings and my wife and my kids.
Right. And then at the end of the year, they will put all of those responses together in an actual book that you can get. And it becomes sort of a autobiography in a lot of ways, or so even a family history in a lot of ways.
That's right. So you can help your family share their story this holiday season with Storyworth. You can just go to storyworth.com/Gleeman today and save $10 on your first purchase. That's STORYWORTH, storyworth.com/Gleeman to save $10 on your first purchase. Storyworth.com/Gleeman.
For instance, John's son or daughter, send him a Storyworth, and the question could be, Daddy, tell us about a time when you were very disappointed in the baseball team you like. And he would say, well, back in the winter of 2022, Carlos Correa.
That'd be too many.
Yeah.
I don't know where do we start with.
Can be a long book.
Yeah.
You don't know. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about some of the Correa stuff, and then we'll talk about the pivots. Well, we'll pivot to the pivot stuff too. I think, a few things. It's tricky that you get blame. I mean, I understand people are upset, and I'm disappointed as well. First of all, I should say it was great to cover Carlos Correa. All the stuff that the Twins talked about was also the media's experience with him, or at least my experience with him. I said this on the Patreon, but I basically, in the couple years I've been doing this job, interviewing Twins and being around the team, I judge players off the field on three things, for my purposes, which is, one, are they available to answer questions? And that's not always the case.
Right.
And Carlos Correa is always available.
Yeah.
After tough losses, he stands there and answers as many questions as you have for him. Number 2, did the player give thoughtful answers to those questions? And that is often not the case, especially tough questions or negative toned questions and those things. He always did. You always got the sense that,
not a lot of cliches.
I mean, some cliches, and he's certainly putting forth a public face on stuff. But I walked up to him several times during the season before a game and said, "Hey, Carlos, you got a minute?" "Yes." This is a real nerdy question, and I asked him some stat question, and then 15 minutes later, he's got his phone out and he's showing me, baseball savant page for something or whatever. Like these are thoughtful responses. And the other thing, and this is probably just selfish of me, is there some humor involved in this person? Do they make you smile or make you laugh, or at least give you some tidbits you can pass along to your audience? Sure. And certainly, as we hopefully portrayed during the season, Carlos Correa did that too. So I feel like that's worth noting. That doesn't mean he's a saint, certainly, as Dodgers fans will tell you. But what I think is, it's interesting how frustrated fans are, in part because this is coming. It's not like they immediately turned around and signed Dansby Swanson. Right. There's this weird zone now where it happens almost every offseason with this front office. We've talked about it. Yeah. Every year at this time, it's like, why haven't they done more? Right. They have X million left under their own spending limits. Is this just going to be there? They don't do it. And indeed, you're hearing, they're going to rebuild now. They're going to take a step back. They're going to, not add anybody. And maybe that's the case, but people have been saying that for 6 years, basically. They usually find a way to spend what you think they're going to spend. They usually find a way to bring in, impact players. I'm very curious to see how they do that this time around. I am too. Because it's very much not clear to me at this point, particularly with Rodon off the board and Swanson being essentially the only impact free agent left, in my mind at least. But it's funny that...
And a market which has continued to be crazy.
It's funny.
Yeah, I mean, Dansby Swanson's also going to be part of that crazy market. He also has a large market team chasing him, the Cubs. And in this case, it feels like Chicago has the tiebreaker because
his wife plays for the soccer team there, and lives there.
Exactly. Right.
But it's funny that the reaction to not re-signing Correa and letting him leave as a free agent is significantly worse in terms of fan morale than never signing him in the first place would have been.
Oh, for sure.
Do you know what I mean?
Oh, for sure, of course.
And so it's one of those where I remember growing up, there were so many basketball coaches and baseball coaches who would tell us, the worst thing you can do is not try. You always try, because then, if you don't try, you always... And sometimes I think, if the Twins had just never signed Correa, then people would never even know that was a possibility, and then the idea of not signing him for $300 million wouldn't have even registered with people.
I'll take it a step further. If they had decided... We're not re-signing Carlos Correa.
Right, and they just said...
And they just had a normal offseason where they were trying to get... We've got $50 million to spend. Let's go throw some money at Abreu. Let's go throw some money at this player, that player. And they did that instead. If they would have not tried to sign Correa, they would probably... I would think they would be in a much better position. Now,
You never know, though.
You don't know.
I talked about this with Burrow yesterday, too, which is there's now the assumption... because of this special circumstance with this specific player, that they have a much wider spectrum of available funds or interest in signing big-name free agents. I don't know that that's the case. Yeah. And in fact, without Correa in the mix, like you said, if they had began the offseason, it's not like we'd have expected them before Christmas to sign a high-end free agent, because they never do that.
Yeah. Do we think they would have gone to 4 years and $19 million a year with Abreu? Right? Like, that doesn't sound like them either, right?
Yeah, I mean, especially at the prices, like you said, that these guys have ended up getting.
That's what I'm saying.
They weren't going to sign Trey Turner. They weren't going to sign Zan for $300 million. Right. The same contracts.
Right.
Maybe you go after a Chris Bassett or a, Jamison Tyon or something like that. Although even the price tags on that were not ones that I would have. Wilson Contreras was never going to sign with the Minnesota Twins. I mean, I just read our Katie Wu, our Cardinals writer. He basically talked to Yadier Molina when the Cardinals and the Cubs played at the end of the season, and they're friends in the catching community, basically. And Molina's was on his farewell tour after 20 years or whatever as the Cardinals catcher. And Contreras said to him after the last game, I'm going to be you. I'm replacing you. And so it's going to be hard. As much as the Twins could say, do you want to replace Sandy Leone and Gary Sanchez? It's a similar vibe, right? But plus he got $87.5 million.
Yeah, I mean, that's another.
I think
across the board, you can take a look at the contracts that people were getting and go, wow, the Twins really going to beat that?
Usually, whether at this stage, because it's been a lot of action early in the offseason, it's been fun, not for the Twins, but fun in general. Usually at the end of the offseason or even 2/3 of the way through the offseason, you look at the top 25 free agent deals and we can point to a handful of them and say, at least from our perspective,
that was a good deal.
I would have taken that for the Twins or that would have looked good for the Twins. I mean, maybe we can try to put together some list for next show, but I'm having a hard time off the top of my head thinking of some. I mean, there's some. But I don't know that not being involved in Correa, or let's flip it around, I don't know that being involved with Correa has necessarily kept them from significant other moves. I'm actually going to ask about this today, hopefully. The idea of, we saw they kept lines of communication open with Rodon and Swanson and some other high-end. They signed Vázquez for $30 million during this time. Like the idea that you have to be focused on Correa, they were obviously, but that doesn't preclude you from having discussions with other people. And let's be honest, they had enough payroll space to re-sign Correa at $30 million a year, sign Vázquez for $10 million a year, and still have $10 or $15 million. So there was the flexibility to have simultaneous, concurrent negotiation.
And they did. And in fact, they went and got Vázquez while they were still, before they knew that Correa wasn't signing with them. I just wonder if they would have gone after some of the other big. But I think that's legitimate. I think it's a fair question as to what, even had they not had Correa, whether or not they would have wanted to pony up and play at that level. When you talk about, you try to find below market deals right now, for me to find, below market deals, I'm taking a look at what signed last year. Do you know what I mean? Like I took a look because one of the pivots we're going to talk about is, maybe you end up buying some overpriced goods from other teams.
Depressed assets.
Yeah, depressed assets is what you call it. Overpriced goods, right? And so I started taking a look. Well, Trevor Story's, 6-year, $140 million contract that he signed last year, or maybe 6 year, 150. I can't remember.
144.
144 is that what it is? Okay.
You were close.
Okay, all right.
I wasn't going to correct you. You corrected yourself. I feel bad when I correct John too much.
That's good. 5 years, getting Trevor Story at 5 years, 120, even though I think right now the Red Sox are probably a little disappointed.
Yeah, he had a bad year.
He had a bad year, etc.
And he didn't even play shortstop.
Right. Right. But you're like, 5 years and 120.
Relative to the deals we've seen.
That's what I'm saying.
No,
right.
Right.
There is an opportunity. Like a bad deal midway through this year.
Right.
In this offseason, it looks like a good deal.
But also think of the same people, and we're including that, who are disappointed or frustrated that they didn't bring back Correa. If they would have said early on in the offseason, this isn't going to happen, we're moving on, and they went and traded for Trevor Story's contract, people would have been like, why would you cut yourself off from the potential of Correa by signing a clearly inferior player? So, I mean, it cuts both ways. I do think that's legitimate, and I hope to dig more into whether or not, or I guess to what extent this not drew their focus away. I mean, they have plenty of ability they got plenty of bandwidth to hold discussions on multiple fronts, but just kept them from being able to get aggressive or fully dive in to some of these deals, or if it didn't do that.
Right.
I will say, I looked of the top 20 free agent starters, like I said there's 3 left, Eovaldi and then 2 lesser guys. The 17 out of the 20 that I ranked, I mean, it's subjective, but that have signed, they have signed 17 players, $957 million worth of contracts, not a cent of which has been spent by the Twins, of course. And then the other thing that I think, while we're in this sort of nothingness zone, which is that there has not been a corresponding move, there has not been a domino effect next move, so all that leaves fans and people like us to sit with is the loss of Correa and the state of the current roster and this uncertainty surrounding, well, what are the pivot points? Are they actually going to try to make a playoff team, or will they take a step back? And once fans start thinking about all that stuff, it's, you get into some dark places with that. But it's hard to blame people from that, because if you look at what they've done this offseason, and I'm surely I'm missing something. The Vázquez deal just became official. How convenient then. And then I'm heading over to Target Field after this. Just got a press release. What a great guess by me that he would do that.
So you actually got confirmation from the Twins PR
No,
department.
they just invited me. You want to show up at 10:30 for what? Brunch? What are we? French toast? What do we got? Now you're going to meet a very rich 5'9" man. Is that something you're interested in? I thought, sure, why not? But here's their offseason, and I'm sure I'm missing something here, but they lost Carlos Correa. They lost the MVP, the unanimous MVP from a non-playoff team. That ain't good. They dumped Gio Urshela for really nothing in return, at least in terms of major league value, and he was one of their best position players last season. They kept Emilio Pagan, which I am legally obligated to not comment further on by Dan Hayes for a while. They missed so far every
Disco Hayes, by the way.
Disco Dan Hayes, which we'd explain that on the Patreon.
We're just calling
That's going to be a mystery. If you're not a Patreon subscriber, he's Disco Dan Hayes. They've missed out on every free agent, every impact free agent, unless they sign Dansby Swanson, but we'll see. And then what did they add? Kyle Farmer, placeholder shortstop backup option. Well, there's no way to view that, particularly coming off back-to-back losing seasons and the collapse of August and September, and not have low morale if you're a fan base. I mean, surely the Twins realize that, right? I mean, like, surely even Dave St. Peter, if you got him on Truth Serum, you know, he might say, well, we're disappointed there hasn't been more fan support or whatever. But it's like, you want to see what y'all have done in the last 6 weeks? Like, why would there be, or the last 2 years? Yeah. Why would there be?
You're going into the year with $105 million worth of payroll right now.
Yes.
Right. Yeah, right.
You would like, if you're an executive, I'm sure, you would like to have established enough with the fan base, as we talk about for the last 6 years, that they are a slow-moving, let it develop, see how it shakes out team.
Every year we comment, we have the same discussion, and every year we say, and for the last 2 or 3 years, we say to ourselves, but they've always managed to spend it.
Right. And so I am willing to give them the benefit of the doubt, although, like I said, the paths are not clear to my brain, at least.
Last year, Carlos Correa had to fall into their lap for them to be able to spend that last $35 million.
Trevor Story or something had that not happened. I mean, they had some other options. But yes, I agree. But that's you're asking an awful lot to ask your thousands of fans, many of whom are not paying as close attention to this stuff,
of course,
to know their when do guys usually sign with the Twins and all this stuff. When you take away significant talent from a roster that has had back-to-back losing seasons, and you do not immediately add that talent, in the time in between that, you've allowed your fan base to come up with the worst possible ideas that can come into their head. And there's been a lot of that over the past several years. We talked about that, by the way, even in years when they eventually do make significant moves. They add Donaldson late. They trade for Maeda late. They add Correa late. All this stuff. You get less bang for your buck in terms of fan morale and ticket sales by doing that in February and March.
Of course,
because it's like, I always use this example. If you're a 250 hitter at the end of the season, you will be perceived as being a much better player if you hit 350 in April and spend the rest of the year going down to 250 than if you hit 150 in April and spend the rest of the year going. Because every time someone checks your name in the box score, your average will be higher for more of the season. And it's the opposite for the Twins. Yes, they would like to tell you, and they surely believe, they've proven this over and over, that it's the end product, that it's the team we put on the field on opening day, to the point that they made the Taylor Rogers trade the eve of what was supposed to be opening day last year. And that's all fine.
But it makes it real hard to renew season tickets.
Right. It makes it, you spend the entire offseason with people getting increasingly upset in their own heads about what's going on. And then in February, you go, oh, see, we added these 3 guys and the team's decent, right? And people go, I don't know. I spent the last 4 months thinking
being
I
angry.
hate it. So, it's a hard, I don't know. I think that's irrelevant. Now, they may not care about that, but it's not a non-factor, I think, in terms of if you're sitting there going, this fan base just seems distraught and angry and frustrated. And I do think there are reasons for that, but I also think there are reasons for that on kind of the margins of things that are happening like that. Now, in terms of what now, that, again, if you want a fuller discussion of Correa and all the negotiations and some behind the scenes stuff, go to patreon.com/Gleeman. We covered that. We did like an hour and a half on just Correa.
You can sign up now and you won't even get charged for the past episodes.
The archive is free.
That's right.
So
you won't get charged till we do another show.
So in terms of what now, Dansby Swanson is the last remaining impact. Now, I will say Dansby Swanson is the most natural possible fallback to Carlos Correa.
Sure.
So in that sense, there's a fit. But I just think Dansby Swanson is going to get like $200 million or close to it. And I just don't see the Twins. Again, at the beginning of the offseason, or even 10 months ago, if you'd have said they're going to be in the mix for Dansby Swanson at $180 million, you'd have been like, the Minnesota Twins? Like, what are we?
Right.
Like, no, they're not.
Right.
And so the fact that we're even talking about that is a strange. The Overton window has changed. The spectrum of things that are possible has changed, at least. Now, that isn't necessarily a good thing because now it just gets people's hopes up. But beyond that, I think Nathan Eovaldi would be a legitimate addition to the rotation, sort of a Sonny Gray-esque veteran starting pitcher. You could pivot.
Or he can be.
Yes, if he's healthy.
If he's healthy.
That's true of Sonny Gray, too.
Right, yeah.
You could pivot to trying to add a kind of bat for hire, Nelson Cruz-esque bat for hire, not at that level, to the lineup. Justin Turner, J.D. Martinez, Michael Brantley. There's a few other names. Those are the three that stood out to me.
Right.
On a 1-year, $17 million deal or whatever it is. There are still, and the shortstop market still has Elvis Andrus, Jose Iglesias, although to me, they don't necessarily seem that much better than Kyle Farmer, unless you want both of those players. Somebody is a utility man or something. But those are not exciting. I mean, those are the moves you need to make to just tread water, having lost Correa.
Those are exactly
not push forward.
Right. Those are almost exactly the moves that we talked about not wanting to see them do. We did not want to see them do. Now, I would say maybe a little higher level than that.
I think a lot of these, if they had been the second biggest move of the offseason, certainly.
Right. Yeah.
If the biggest move was Carlos Correa returning, then anything as a second move is acceptable. But, if these were the secondary moves of the offseason, Nathan Eovaldi, Justin Turner, J.D. Martinez, something, whatever, a reliever, something like that, these are more acceptable. But no, I said in print, and I think we talked about this, if they do not add, an impact player, which now only Dansby Swanson qualifies for that, and that's at the low end, I would say. In free agency, there are trade options, clearly, which we can talk about in a second. But if they do not add an impact player this offseason, I believe it's a failure of an offseason. You've lost an impact player.
Right.
And you're not losing them from a team that won 100 games. You're losing your best player, Carlos Correa, you've lost from a team that went 78 and 84. Now, they'll tell you with injuries, it's a better baseline talent level than 78 and 84, but it wasn't 2 years ago. And so I think it's not enough to just add some good quality role players, components, even sort of secondary stars like Eovaldi or whatever. Right. If that alone is what happens, I don't think that's enough. I think it is a failure of an offseason.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of where we would have been. Let's say at the beginning of the offseason, we said, well, they're not going to go chase Correa, but they are targeting Eovaldi and Brantley. And
I mean, it would be a very typical Twins offseason to expect
Turner,
that.
Right.
Those are exactly the type of names we would, list as potential targets the previous 6 years. But again, the Correa thing changed it.
Right.
And the Correa thing, particularly after back-to-back, losing seasons, the status quo is not good enough with this team. Just counting on injuries to fix everything is, I think, the foolest of fool's gold. Right. Because these players who were injured do not get clean slates. And so the idea that, everybody was injured last year, so if we get them healthy, that'll provide 10 more wins. That's true.
Right.
But a lot of these guys, you have no idea if they'll be healthy.
Yeah.
Tyler Mahle or Maeda or Buxton for that matter. And so the last point on this, and then we can talk a little bit about Vázquez maybe, just so if he asks, have you talked about me? I can say yes.
We did a whole hour and a half on you.
Yeah. Skip to the 3/4 part.
Actually, we didn't even do that. We probably spent 45 minutes on him and another Patreon. 45 minutes on Correa.
True. You're right. I know that, like we said, you leave open the possibility of fans having bad thoughts when you do things like this. And so one of those thoughts is, aren't they just going to say, hey, we tried, and we're not just going to spend money to spend money, and we're going to take a step back, or we're going to rebuild, or however they want to phrase it. Right. And enter the season, they'll add a player or two here, but they enter the season with a $120 million payroll and try to get healthy and try to focus on the future and all that stuff. All the things we've heard before about the Twins. I'm not saying that's an impossibility, but I'm saying if that happens, whether they say it outright, which is unlikely, or their actions show it over the next 2 to 3 months, That to me is absolutely unacceptable, given the state of this franchise.
I will be really surprised.
I will be too.
That.
Just if only because
I was surprised that came up in one of Hayes' stories.
Well, people know the Twins. The Twins have well-earned reputation in a lot of areas for this type of thing. Yeah. That goes well prior to this front office.
Sure.
But I would be surprised if only because that would be such a dramatic 180 U-turn from offering a guy $285 million a day after you signed a 32-year-old catcher to a 3-year, $30 million deal, and then a week later you're going to go, we're focusing on 2 years from now.
Right.
Well, it's like, well, okay, what did you sign Vázquez for? When they signed Christian Vázquez, I don't know what percentage they would have put on it at the time, but they did not view themselves as likely, over 50% to sign Carlos Correa. I don't think they viewed them. A Twins official said to me in San Diego, like day 2 of San Diego, when they were having multiple meetings with Correa talking to him every day on the phone, adding to their offer, negotiating all that. They said, we're not in the driver's seat, is what they said.
Right.
They did not think that they were going to sign Carlos Correa. They thought they had a puncher's chance of signing Carlos Correa. Right. And so their lack of moves and the one move they did make, Vázquez, were made with the knowledge that there might be a 20%, like we put odds on. Yeah. Maybe they felt it was a little higher than that, 30%. Right. They didn't think it was 51%, I'll put it that way. And so if you didn't think you were likely to sign Carlos Correa or Rodon or Swanson, you wouldn't have made the Christian Vázquez signing, sign a 32-year-old catcher to a 3-year deal at a pretty decent salary. If the reaction to not signing Correa, which again you didn't think was likely, was rebuilding or taking a step back. Well, why would a team do that unless they just had no plan whatsoever? And what I am confident about this front office is that they do have plans in place. Now, I'm not saying those are good plans. I'm not saying those plans have worked out well. I'm not saying that you should trust the plans themselves, but they do have, they didn't get the text from Boris saying, hey, we're going to San Francisco, and then go, oh my God, we got to think of something.
Right. Yes. Right.
Now, what those somethings they already have thought of, I'm very curious to hear and see play out. And if they're actually, reachable is a whole nother thing, obviously.
Before we get to Vázquez, though, we should just talk about one of the, the obvious way to do. Oh yeah,
let's get our last sponsor, which is Raycon. I was using these the other day on a Zoom I was doing.
Raycon earbuds.
Raycon earbuds. They're great. I prefer them over some, let's say, bigger name and certainly higher priced alternatives because I just like
definitely higher price.
The fit in your ear. Like if you're on an hour Zoom call or like John and Chris, you take them out running for hours at a time. You don't want something that actually makes your ear uncomfortable. Right. And I find these to be very comfortable, good fit. They have a good battery life. They're very easy for dummies like me even to pair up with Bluetooth. My girlfriend uses them for
32 hours of battery
6 hours a day,
They've
basically.
got the gel tips that, like you said, it's one of those things where, you can pay a lot for earbuds if you want to pay a lot for earbuds. But if you want just well-engineered earbuds that
at a good price point,
again, they're comfortable and have good battery life and have lots of playtime and everything else.
Give Raycon a try. Here's what you can do. You can go to buyraycon.com/Gleeman. That's BUY, like buy it. Buyraycon.com/Gleeman to get 15% off your Raycon order. That's buyraycon.com/Gleeman to score 15.
Great Christmas present
off.
Yeah.
Okay. So,
and affordable.
You could also potentially try to trade for a shortstop. I mean,
right. That's what I was just going to talk
Brandon
about.
Crawford is now either going to be a third baseman or
he's
trade
a 5 and 10 guy.
Well, yeah, but does he want to play third base for them? I read an article that he talked to Andrew Bagerly, who's the Dan Hayes of the Giants for The Athletic, I would say, longtime Giants writer and former Jeopardy contestant like Doe.
Oh, okay.
He talked to Crawford, and Crawford said, I got a call from them. It was my first communications about anything Correa related. 15 minutes after the news of the signing broke.
Oh, really?
From the GM and the manager called him on a joint call and said, hey, we just signed Carlos Correa. You're going to move positions. And they're lucky in the sense that he's
a good guy.
Lifetime San Francisco Giant. Right. And he's won 3 championships. And he's a professional. And he's a really well-respected veteran 35-year-old player because he's a 3 or 4-time Gold Glove winner. He's a 3-time World Series champ. He's, had some MVP caliber seasons. But yeah, it sounds like he's going to be moving to third base. You can make a call on him potentially, although last year he wasn't very good and he's 35. Right. You could make a call on the Padres shortstop Kim, who they signed a couple years ago from Korea, who is I think going to slide to second base now with Bogarts at shortstop, but he was a Gold Glove caliber shortstop last year who hit a little bit too. There are some, Willie Adames from the Brewers, if you really wanted to take a big swing on an all-star caliber shortstop, you could do that. I mean, there are alternatives specific to shortstop, although part of me wonders, again, if it was, this player only, that they were willing to mess with that position long term for Carlos Correa, not necessarily for, fill in the blank averages shortstop, because they have Farmer, they have Lewis coming that they still hope midseason is going to be ready. They have Brooks Lee, who could potentially be a shortstop. I think, do they need to add a shortstop? It's similar to the rotation to me. They could always use a better starting pitcher, but they got to be better than the guys they have.
That's right.
Signing Andrews or Iglesias or trading for, even Brandon Crawford at age 35, 36, I don't know that he's that much better than Kyle Farmer, or at least big enough difference to make up for the money it would require or the players it would require in trade. So that's a pivot option. I mean, a literal fallback to him at shortstop, but, I don't know. I just, they need to find impact talent.
We talked a lot on the Patreon about, the difficulties doing a trade. Right, in that, frankly, right now the Twins are in an odd position where they actually have it's like they've got more money and less prospects.
Right, which never happens.
Yeah, that's right.
They've traded 5 of
which still leaves open the option of trading for an overpriced asset where you're not really giving up much in the way of prospects. You're just taking on what is perceived as a bad contract. Right. The problem with that is, there are only so many players that A, are overpriced and have bad contracts, and B, still good enough that they provide an upgrade for you.
That's exactly
over those particular spots.
It's not that even some of these are bad contracts. It's that they're no longer clearly positive value relative to the contract.
That's right.
If you're a player you have 3 years and $20 million per season left on your contract, and you've just become sort of a good, solid regular. It's not that that's a bad contract that you'd be like, oh, I'll take it, but you got to attach prospects to it or whatever. It's just like, all right, would you get less than that as a free agent? Yeah, but
you're essentially sort of targeting the kind of guys that, if they were put on waivers, probably would not be claimed because nobody wants that contract. It's just, generally when that happens, it's because they stink. Right. They're not usually at all-star level, but they have.
We saw it with Donaldson. Obviously,
it can happen.
That's essentially what happened with the Twins and Donaldson.
That's right. But maybe we can get him.
He's available. I saw an article. I'm not even kidding. There was a headline in the New York Post last night that said, Yankees having difficulty moving Donaldson Hicks. They're trying to trade Aaron Hicks and Josh Donaldson and probably Kiner Falefa, Twins legend, Isaiah Kiner Falefa.
All ex-Twins.
Which I was like, you got any more of that? You want to trade us? I don't even know who else they would have. But, it's a weird position, like you said, they have some prospects they could trade, certainly.
Sure.
But you've already depleted what is sort of an average-ish farm system right now by trading a handful of your top prospects, Spencer Steer, Christian Encarnacion Strand, before that Chase Petty to get Sonny Gray. I mean, they already traded some B-level or even A-minus level prospects. And they have some left, but, it's tricky to do that at the deadline and then do it in the middle of the offseason. They have some major leaguers they could trade, but, we saw the reaction to Dan saying they're open to talking about deals for Arise. People were furious about that. But what else are you going to trade but players who are good and liked to get players who are good and liked? So it's a weird spot that they almost need to find a way to leverage their money for really the first time ever, which is like, we have more, if you assume their payroll is going to be similar to last year, which is like in the 140 to 150 range. Let's call it 150. They're at like 105 right now or something like that, roughly. So they have $40 or $50 million to spend. You need to find a way to leverage that available, almost like salary cap space, even though it's not, to take on a contract or take on a depressed asset or maybe overpay for a free agent or something where you can say, it didn't cost us the maximum premium in terms of prospect capital or having to trade a well-liked major league veteran player to get this done. We were able to use some or all of our money to kind of lessen the total price tag in terms of value.
And that might mean paying, in this market, stupid money for a player. But you can spend stupid money. The only thing more stupid than spending stupid money is not spending stupid money. That's really stupid money.
That was my criticism always of Terry Ryan, which is, you don't get, there's no degree of difficulty award bonus.
Right. If you leave $40 million on the table,
right.
you just gave away $40 million to a zero WAR player.
Right. There's an opportunity cost of not using that.
Right.
I don't know. Should we talk a little bit about poor Christian Vázquez?
Yes, let's do that. Yes, please. Yes.
Moment in the sun here. So, at the beginning of the offseason, like literally the end of season media session, Falvey spoke very clearly and said we is a priority for us.
He mentioned two needs.
Yeah.
They said, what are your two needs? Or what are your needs?
He said health.
He said,
no, here's the,
he said
I said
shortstop
to him,
and catcher.
Yeah.
That's what he said.
No, well, first I said, don't say health. What are your other biggest needs? And he said health. And then somebody said, okay, now what are your actual, and he said, shortstop and catcher.
Right.
And what he said at catcher was, we still think Ryan Jeffers has a chance to be a really good player. But if you look at Ryan Jeffers' performance, he struggled to stay healthy and he struggled to be consistent offensively. We are not in a position to just say you're our starting catcher. We need to find a way to be able to bring in a veteran player to pair with him, whether it's a 50-50 split, 60-40, 70-30, where you can play Jeffers mostly against lefties initially, which are the favorable matchups for him.
Right.
Keep him away from tough righties against whom he's really struggled, and find a durable veteran, good defensive catcher who has enough bat to, if you have to play him 90 games instead of 80 games or instead of 50 games, that it works. And he also said at the time, I would love to find a left-handed hitter.
Yeah, obviously, the natural fit would be a left-handed,
the right-handed
catcher,
Jeffers to make a true platoon. Now, there were two lefty bats at catcher free agents, Omar Narvaez and Tucker Barnhart, who's a switch hitter. Now, I view Tucker Barnhart as, I'm sure he's a well-liked guy, but he's a backup. To me, Narvaez was the only sort of starting caliber guy who fit the description of what they claimed to be looking for. And I was a little surprised that they didn't go after him. He signed last night with the Mets.
I was like,
a 1-year deal with a player option. I haven't heard the money, which is essentially a 2-year deal at that point. So but it was clear, I believe we reported this, Dan Hayes and I, like a month ago, that Vázquez was their number one target. They ended up having to go the whole time over Narvaez. They didn't talk to Wilson Contreras, all that. They felt Vázquez was the best fit, even though he's a right-handed hitter. They thought from a durability standpoint, from a pitch framing and throwing standpoint, he's very good. He's been on 2 World Series winning teams. He has a very good clubhouse, leadership reputation in Boston. And he's an average-ish hitter for the position. He's never going to light it up that you're going to go, wow, this guy's great. But it's very important, especially for premium defensive positions, catcher, shortstop, center field, to not compare them to the average hitter across baseball, because that includes DHs, first basemen, left fielders, but to compare them to their position. The key is finding guys who outperform the average player at their position. And so, he hits 265. He doesn't strike out much. He doesn't walk much. He puts the ball in play. He hits some doubles. He hits, 5 or 10 homers. He had 1 year, 4 years ago, where he hit 20 homers, but I wouldn't expect that. And he's consistently been an above-average hitter for catchers.
Sure.
And what makes him, I think, a better fit than just the right-handed tandem with Jeffers is that he's had very neutral platoon splits. And in fact, over the last 3 years combined, he's been slightly better against righties than lefties, which is surely a statistical fluke. Right. Over enough time, almost every right-handed hitter is at least, 10% better against lefties. And for his career, that's been true. But the idea is he's not a guy who benefits as much as Jeffers from facing left-handed pitchers, which allows you to almost treat him like a left-handed hitter and play Vázquez against most righties and some lefties, and play Jeffers against most lefties and some righties where they feel he's a less bad matchup in those spots. And so I do think it's a decent fit. I will also say this, Ryan Jeffers can change a lot of people's opinions by staying healthy and playing well in whatever role they give him. Yep. And the opportunity is there for him to work his way back into a bigger share and become the starter and all that. But if you said I have to bet $10,000 on which catcher is going to start more games for the Minnesota Twins in 2023, I will take Vázquez all day, and I'd probably lay you 10 starts. Right. You know what I mean? Like I'd probably make Vázquez minus 10 or minus 15 starts. I think, he has shown the ability to do that from a durability and production standpoint. They're going to feel very comfortable with him behind the plate. And the other thing is, if the changes to the bases themselves does lead to what they hoped, which is more base stealing attempts, he's thrown out almost twice as many runners, 36% for his career versus Jeffers being at like 19%. So he's much more able to control a running game that may become kind of souped up here by some of the rule changes. It's yet to be seen. But he's a good pitch framer. He's durable. The pitchers that throw to him in Boston, I've read tons of quotes from
good
them
at framing pitches high in the zone as opposed to low.
Yeah, although he got
generally.
good. I'm actually going to ask him, but it's my only real question for him is why was he better the last couple of years low if he changed some things?
Lots of stories on Twins Daily about Vázquez, and especially some stuff on pitch framing.
Those. Wait 2 days and read my story about him.
Yeah, I mean, he's an average catcher. I mean, he's just
average. I would say he's an average starting catcher in the major league.
He's just sort of a good, solid. Here's the guy that you're going to plug in there for 100. I think you can get 110, 120 out of him if you want to.
Right.
I don't think the Twins are going to want to, but like if you think back to the Jason Castro days, like
which was their first ever free agent signing,
right? Who was also a good hitter for a catcher, but a below average hitter kind of overall.
Yeah.
Right. You're just hoping he stays healthy and he holds down the position and it gives, Jeffers some time to find what Jeffers needs to find to become that guy.
I think as importantly, allows them to not have to force feed Jeffers if Jeffers does not find that. If Jeffers is just who we've seen, and they were wrong about his upside.
Right.
And he just is sort of backup platoon catcher,
who's going to kick the crap out of left-handed pitching, right?
His flaws are what they are. It doesn't leave them in a position where they go, we have no choice. We got to let Jeffers sink or swim.
That's right.
This, they can ease him into a role. And by the way, if one of them gets hurt, you still have the other one who's, it doesn't leave them where Sandy Leon becomes their starting catcher.
And this is a case where, you're talking much smaller dollars here, but where they were fairly aggressive in terms of the contract that they ended up giving him. Like I think he made more than what we heard was that he was trying to get a 4-year deal from somebody. And I think at some point the Twins were kind of convinced that they were not convinced, but were skeptical that they were going to be able to sign him because they thought he might get a 4-year deal from somebody.
Right.
Instead, he ended up taking a pretty good 3-year, $30 million deal, which exceeded sort of what I think people expected because the catching market was just really tight this year.
Yes, there just weren't that many options. I mean, when he was, I would say, the consensus number 2 option behind Wilson Contreras, and then the third option was Narvaez, who, by the way, has been pretty bad in 2 out of the last 3 years, but offers a little more maybe hitting upside at least. But yeah, I mean, I talked to somebody at the winter meetings who was with a team that was also negotiating with him at the time, and I believe they offered him 2 years and a vesting option or something like that. Right. And I think
he's 32 years old.
Right.
Like, you don't want to be going 4 years on a 32-year-old.
I'm certain the Twins' initial offer was 2 years.
I would guess
maybe 2 years and an option or something.
Vesting option.
They got pushed to 3 years because he had a pretty good market. I mean, my understanding is there were at least 5 or 6 other teams made him multi-year offers, along with the Twins, which pushes you to 3 years. It pushes you from what they probably had hoped was $7 or $8 million a year to a full $10 million a year. Right. But also, a starting catcher is, we were spoiled by Joe Mauer.
Right. And Pierzynski for that matter.
Yeah, true. I mean, the Twins have had some good catchers over the years, but it's very difficult to find, as we've seen now over the last 3 or 4 years, it's very difficult to find durability, defense, and a level of hitting that is not a black hole in a catcher. And Vázquez checks that box consistently in a way that, maybe a dozen other catchers in baseball. Well, that's the other thing. We talked about this with the relievers a lot, but there's a point at which prior durability can be viewed one of 2 ways. Which is, I remember when they signed Addison Reed 5 years ago or whatever. It was, this guy has appeared in more games over the last 5 years than any reliever in baseball. He's got a rubber arm. Well, that's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is this guy's been ridden harder than anybody in baseball. And it turns out he barely pitched for the Twins because he blew out. With Vázquez, and certainly the track record of catchers 31, 32, 33 and beyond is not great. I mean, we've seen that with Twins catchers over the years. It's wonderful in theory that he's a guy who has caught, I think, 5 different years out of the last 7. He's caught more than half of his team's games, including a couple years with 100+ starts for the Red Sox. That's great. does that mean he's durable and you can count on him for that? Or does that mean he's got a lot of mileage on the old odometer? We're going to find out. I mean, there's no way to not do that. But it's very difficult in free agency. You're not going to get a lot of 25-year-old free agents.
Right, that's right. Yeah.
So, that's what you get.
If you do, they're real expensive.
Yeah, I mean, there was a 27-year-old free agent named Carlos Correa who was available last offseason. Let's see. Is there any other thing before I depart and speak to much richer people than John Bonus? Although... do you get, how is your 3-year, $30 million? Is it a even split? You get 10 a year?
I'm going to push for 4, but.
Team options. I got a lot of options on John Bonus.
A vesting option.
Okay. So I guess final thoughts here is, I think there's every right for people to be frustrated, disappointed, with the Correa thing. I think the idea, it's inevitable that you can say, oh, we got our hopes up, because that's how fandom works. I'm not convinced that it kept them, the focused pursuit of Correa. I'm not convinced that kept them from making other moves that would have really gotten people excited.
Maybe.
But with that said, whether or not it did, we're in this place now. You can only look forward. It doesn't matter what happened. I mean, you have to step forward and keep going, push ahead. Yep. If they go into rebuild mode, whether they say it or not, if their actions speak to that, you will not hear me defend that decision making for a second on this show. I think it would be absolutely ridiculous. I think it would be, kicking a fan base when it's already down and really applying pressure to people's fandom. Right. And basically daring them to continue to be fans. Now, I don't think this is the path they're going to take. I do think they're going to try to make moves.
I think we were at the point in the offseason, though, and I think we reach this point almost every offseason, where the topic becomes one of the topics you and I bring up is, what's the over-under on their payroll next year? Do you know what I mean? Yeah. And they have always managed to hit the over.
It's true.
Right? But we take a look, and I think we often are doing this in January or in February. Right now, we're doing it in December.
Right.
Well, last year we did it at the end of November because we took a look at it. Right. There was the lockout, right? But where we say, I just don't know how they're spending that money.
Right. And obviously spending it just to spend it.
That is also the litmus test on whether they say they're rebuilding or not, is whether or not they're rebuilding.
The payroll will tell the story.
Exactly. The payroll will tell the story.
If they start trading away Kepler and they trade away Sonny Gray or they trade away whoever, and the payroll is $100 million where it was $145 million last year, that's a rebuild. Right. That's a step back, whether they say it or not.
Right.
At the same time, if they just sign JD Martinez to a 1-year, $30 million deal, well, that's going to check the salary box. We're going to say, oh, their payroll's up to 135 now.
It's not a successful offseason, but it's also not a rebuild.
It's not a rebuild. You're correct about that. I don't think they're going to rebuild. And if I'm wrong about that,
or reload.
Yeah, they wouldn't ever call it a rebuild or something like that. Last year I asked Falvey that, and he said, I do not use that word. I was like, well, okay. But what I'm very curious now, from today forward, is do they feel pressure to make moves? I think that's the case. Internal pressure, fan pressure, whatever. But beyond that, do they feel pressure to make moves now, as opposed to their usual thing of let the whole thing play out?
They'll let it play out.
Let this simmering pot of lowering fan morale just continue to bubble over for 2 months, and then
I'll say this: I think Dansby Swanson is going to sign before Christmas.
Yes, so do I.
And so, if the question is, are they going to make a move now? I guess the answer is, if it's Dansby Swanson, they're making a move now. And if they're not getting Dansby Swanson, then they probably are not making a move now, and they probably don't feel the pressure to make a move now.
Right.
This is one of those cases where I don't feel they feel pressure because of the clock. They feel pressure because of this is available now, and it might not be available later. Do you know what I mean?
I think it's weird because they've earned the benefit of the doubt in terms of, which we discuss a lot, but in terms of assuming that the payroll now will not be the payroll on opening day.
Right.
Assuming that they will spend what people think they will spend, and that usually takes the form of some relatively big swings on players. However, and I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt there, But it is tricky in the meantime to give them the benefit of the doubt. But
even last year took a unicorn contract to come in at the last second, right?
But I'm willing to give that benefit of the doubt, even though it's tricky to fool your brain into giving them that in the meantime. But what I will also say in tandem with that is they do not deserve the benefit of the doubt in assuming that those eventual moves will be good ones, that those eventual moves will equal a winning playoff team. Yeah. Because more often than not, including each of the past 2 years, that has not been the case. Right. So it's a weird sort of simultaneous thought process, which is even if you're willing to believe that come opening day, the payroll is going to be closer to 150 than 100, and even if you assume that would entail adding players who may not be at the all-star caliber, but impact players, good players, known players, players that fill clear needs and add value. Even if you assume all that, it's an entirely different assumption and requiring a little bit more leap of faith to assume those will be successful moves, at least in the sense that it will make them on paper an 88-win team instead of an 88-win team. Yeah, I mean, and that to me, I got to see that to believe it because I don't know. I don't see it.
I mean, we just talked about how you can take a look at this team on spring training when pitchers and catchers report and say, well, this was not a rebuild, but that doesn't mean it was a successful offseason.
Exactly.
And in fact, that second one, it's hard to see how it's going to be a successful offseason at this point. Right. I mean, it didn't have to be Correa, but it had to be. Yes, it had to be more. And I mean,
especially now that you don't have Correa for sure.
Right.
I mean,
or Rodon.
You have to answer both of those things. The first question they have to answer is: are you pushing forward to attempt to make the playoffs?
Right.
Are you not taking a step back? Are you not rebuilding? Whatever phrasing you want to use. First of all, answer that, and then if you've answered affirmative to that. Then the bigger question is, are these moves going to actually be good?
Right.
Is the finished product here that you're going to trot out there on April, whatever, is it actually going to be on paper a team that is, a fighting chance with Cleveland or Chicago in this division, which shouldn't be that high of a bar to clear.
Right.
And it's not so much that I doubt both of those things. It's that my silly brain, my limited capacity at this moment,
right.
I cannot see sort of seamless transition points or clear pivot paths from where they are today to that opening day team, checking all the boxes that people want to check.
Yep.
If they don't move quickly on that stuff, it's going to be a rough couple of months for people to just sit and think about all these questions that we've been thinking about here. Yeah. All right. I have to go over to Target Field.
Yes. Thank you very much to our sponsors, Raycon and Storyworth and BetterHelp. We will not be doing a show next Friday.
Unless something happens.
We probably will be doing a Patreon sometime. Yeah.
Join the Patreon. Patreon. Patreon.com/Gleeman.
We'll probably be doing a mailbag this week. If there's a Dansby Swanson signing, we'll absolutely be covering it. Otherwise, you're waiting 2 weeks to cover the Dansby Swanson signing.
All right. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you when we talk to you.
Gleeman